Greetings and welcome to episode 2 of KurtApproved. My name's Kurt Wilson. And I figured after that first podcast that I would go into episode 2. We'll see how long this is going to be, and it might be more than one. You might want to break it down. But I wanted to kind of cover some of the influencers, not only in my life, but some of those influencers that have had an impact not only on the United States but throughout the world. So I did what most people would do. I went to the Google machine and used a couple Googles and found out that there's a couple websites that have compiled like the top 100 most influential people, biographies.com and then another biography website. And what I found interesting is that one list didn't mention any women on it at all. And the other list that I used, I only went off of two. And I'm sure there's more lists, and people are going to have arguments that there's better lists than the ones that I used. And I'd be welcome to take a look at those lists and at some point probably cover some of the people that I've missed. By no means is this going to be a all-inclusive, all-encapsulated covering everybody that's on everybody's list. This is just two lists that I went through and picked a couple of the people on there, and then just took the time to look at their biographies and go through and highlight some of the information about them. Are these my list? Like I said, no. But it's a good start. And as we go on further down this path, I'm sure I'm going to add to it. I've got a couple books already in the back of my mind that I want to cover. But the one thing both these lists did have in common was religious leaders. And it would be a big disservice not to even discuss that when we talk about any type of influence on the world. At the end of the day, I mean, we have wars that are based on religious beliefs, so to not mention that would be a disservice. Am I going to take the time to talk about the people that are on these lists that are religious leaders? No. That's just one of those avenues that I chose to leave out. There's some things in life that just cause so much debate, or it's really not a debate. It's my point of view and your point of view is wrong. And if you wanted to have a open debate or conversation about it, then I would be all up for it. So one of the lists had Jesus of Nazareth at the top, and the other list had Muhammad. So again, it's and then that same list that had Muhammad at the top had Jesus listed as number 3, and then on the other list, Muhammad was ranked at 7. So I'm not really sure. It didn't say how they figured out how to rank these people as such. But I would say at the end of the day that there would probably be some bias put into these lists on upbringing and religious beliefs. So, one of them, Mikhail Gorbachev, number 3. Winston Churchill, number 5. Martin Luther King, number 8. Followed by Abraham Lincoln at number 9. And number 10, Nelson Mandela. 21, Napoleon. Like George Washington was 14. Gandhi, 19. Adolf Hitler is on the list as number 12. That's an interesting take, which is of course, you couldn't really leave somebody with that type of influence and power that started, a whole world war off a list. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, number 23. Charles Darwin, 24. Sir Isaac Newton, down on number 25 on this list, followed by Confucius. You got Queen Victoria, number 28. Alexander the Great, 32. Moses, 33. Woodrow Wilson, number 34. Christopher Columbus, 35. Galileo, 37. Joan of Arc, 39. As we keep looking through the list, you got Leonardo da Vinci at number 49. Louis Pasteur at 50. Einstein at 52. Margaret Thatcher, 56. Then John F. Kennedy at 58. Mr. Boris Yeltsin at 59. Rosa Parks, 63. Malcolm X at 67. Johann Gutenberg at 73. Sigmund Freud, 76. Mother Teresa at number 77. Michael Faraday at 84. Edison at 86. Eleanor Roosevelt at 88. Tesla, 92. Alexander Fleming, 93. I believe that's Sir Alexander Fleming, if I recall correctly. Henry Ford at 96. Benjamin Franklin at 100 on that list. And when I look at this other list, Newton was number 2. Confucius at number 5. Gutenberg, Johann at number 8. Quite a jump on this list for him. Einstein at number 10. Pasteur at 11. Big jump for him. Darwin was 16. This one has Caesar on it at 18. Faraday's at 23, so another big leap for him. George Washington, 26. How about 28? Orville and Wilbur Wright. You could argue change the whole dynamics of the world right with them. Genghis Khan at 29. Shakespeare, 31. Napoleon's 34. Edison at 35. Hitler, 39. Alexander Graham Bell, 42. Let's see who else is on this list. Beethoven, 45. So this list has got a bunch of different folks on it. Some of the influence would have been more on the arts and entertainment area. Some of them leaders and such of countries. Bach's on the list. Freud, William the Conqueror, Julius Caesar, Joseph Stalin, Jefferson, Cortez. So like I said, it didn't really explain how these lists came about, who selected them, or the importance of the rank. And it's just one of the reasons why I kind of wanted to do this as like the second episode was to hopefully open eyes to understand that throughout our life, or even our daily interaction, that we have people of influences on us. Some of them are the leaders of the country that we live in, or even the town or the state. And then some of it crazy anymore is you have a whole website application app, Instagram, that is just based on influencers. People make a living by promoting products and having an influence over their audience. And it's just a totally different world that we live in today. So I just, you look back and you look at some of the people that are on this list and wonder if they had the ability to really promote themselves with a tweet or a post on the Insta, a TikTok, all of that stuff. Would they have more power today, more influence? Or would some of these people that we look back on, would have people dug dirt up or posted something and caught something out of context and done these people in? You just don't have a whole lot of people today, I think, leading the charge to move into new areas. You've got Elon Musk with Tesla kind of pushing that envelope, and SpaceX and all of that stuff with that. So we still have people today doing, that. But just really makes you wonder. So one of the people that was on the top of towards the top of the one list was Mikhail Gorbachev. And I think everybody's know who he is one way or the other. Some of us more than others. Those of us that were alive during the Cold War and the end of it really know who he was and such. So Mikhail Gorbachev was the General Secretary of the Soviet Union Communist Party from 1985 to 91. He was also the first democratically elected president in 1990. Gorbachev played a key role in dismantling the communist grip on the power in both the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. So here's a guy that's the first elected president in the Soviet Union. And he aspires for reform. And by doing so, opened up the way for the end of the Cold War and bringing down the Berlin Wall. And then he was removed from the presidential office in 91, and during a failed coup attempt. Since leaving office, Gorbachev has worked tirelessly promoting new efforts at social justice. So he's elected in 90, and then in 91, he's removed from office. In October of 1990, Gorbachev was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. So, he's born in 1931 to a poor peasant family. Here's a guy that comes from an unprivileged lifestyle. At the age of 11, the district was occupied by the Germans for 3 years. Tough time for all in the village. In 1950, he enrolled at Moscow University, where he became a member of the Soviet Union Communist Party. It was here that Gorbachev met his future wife. So goes off to college, meets his wife, joins the Communist Party. After gaining a degree in law, Gorbachev made much progress within the Communist Party. Gorbachev gained a reputation for being hardworking, honest, and a good, loyal communist member. I think a lot of people today don't really understand what it was like to be living in the Soviet Union. You had to be what they deemed a good, loyal communist member. Unlike his other colleagues, he was moderate in drinking and not interested in gaining financial benefits. So here's a guy that's just so focused on working hard, but he's not really worried about the income. So back to the biography. In 1980, he was the youngest member, and in 1985, he was elected General Secretary of the Communist Party. The relatively youthful Gorbachev stood in marked contrast to the aging members. So here's a guy that gets elected at a young age, and it's the beginning of the changing of the guard. The KGB were happy to see Gorbachev elected as they felt he had the capacity to improve the Soviet Union. Little did they know where that was going to go, huh? So on becoming the leader of the Soviet Union, Gorbachev announces two key policies. One of them, he's going to reform the economy and open it up to the market forces. Crazy thoughts, For the longest time, the markets were closed and controlled. Now he's going to open them up. And then the other one was political reform. This involved freedom of religion, expression, and individual liberties. Paved the way for this opened the doors for democracy, for the political prisoners to be released. It was particularly significant for the Eastern Bloc, where Eastern European economies made calls for democracy. The Soviet Union no longer stood in their way. So he starts changing things in not only the Soviet Union, but the Eastern Bloc. And then a year after becoming leader, there's a massive explosion at Chernobyl. The multiple failings and efforts to cover up the serious safety breaches only reinforced Gorbachev's view that the communist system needed serious reform. So here's an incident that happens, and the system just allows them to cover it up, and it makes the situation way worse. So then, he after that incident, he decides he's going to start working on the arms race. On the international scene, Gorbachev aspires to end the arms race. As he said, we need star peace, not star wars. And that's a reference to, Ronald Reagan wanting to put together a Star Wars. It was putting a nuclear defense system up in space. So Gorbachev builds up a good relationship with the U.S. leader Ronald Reagan, and especially with the U.K. leader Margaret Thatcher. He surprised the world by offering to make big concessions in the to get rid of nuclear warheads. He had been credited with playing a major role in ending the Cold War in both the Eastern and also West. In his Nobel address of June 91, he offered an optimistic view of how countries might work together to build a better world. And here's a quote from that. I am an optimist, and I believe that together we shall be able to make the right historical choice so as not to miss the great chance at the turn of the century and millennium, and make the certain extreme difficult transition to a peaceful world order. So here he's announcing to the world that he wants to disarm, and he wants the rest of the countries to disarm and work towards a peaceful world order. Today that doesn't sound, too difficult or too out of the norm, but I guess as somebody that was living during that time, this was quite the big step forward. Getting the Berlin Wall tore down, opening that up. 91, conservative military forces attempted a coup to overthrow Gorbachev to save the Soviet Union and communist system. The life of Gorbachev was in serious jeopardy. The coup eventually failed, but on returning to Moscow, political power had shifted. Gorbachev resigns and never made a successful return to Russian politics. This opened the door for Boris Yeltsin to come in. Although unpopular in Russia for his perceived role in the breakup of the Soviet Union, he remained an influential voice. Although he had previously supported Putin, in 2011, Gorbachev criticized his third term as Russian president. Gorbachev also warned that in Russia, politics is increasingly turning into imitation democracy, with all the power in the executive branch. So here he's warning the Soviet people that if you're not careful, you're going to turn us back to where we were before, with this imitation of what's comes across as democracy. So back to the bio. Gorbachev has officially stated that he is an atheist. However, at the same time, he has been open to religious influence. He has admired the life of Pope John Paul II, and he's quoted as saying, "I believe in the cosmos. All of us are linked to the cosmos. Look at the sun. If there is no sun, then we cannot exist. So nature's my God. To me, nature is sacred. Trees are my temples, and forests are my cathedrals." That's I'm sure that had to scare some of the people over there, saying that he wasn't tied to any religious beliefs. I think some people like to believe that people are governed by a higher being of such. So, and him openly admitting that he's an atheist, I'm sure that was frightful. So what did he do to change the world? When Gorbachev came back to the bio, when Gorbachev came to power in 1985, there was a very real threat of nuclear war. I would say in 85, the threat was there. It was nothing like it would have been during the Cuban Missile Crisis. But, again, anybody that was alive during that time can remember, the talk of, the Russians bombing us or World War III and it being a real thing. Back to the bio. In the Soviet Union, the Communist Party had maintained a grip on the country ever since the revolution of 1917. In 1985, there seemed no hope for the vast power and reach of the Communist Party to be challenged, let alone transformed. Gorbachev was a committed socialist, but he was also interested in the truth, and from his own career in communist bureaucracy, was aware of the Soviet Union's limitations. After the Chernobyl disaster of 1985, Gorbachev's resolve to reform communism began in earnest. It was Gorbachev who sought to free political prisoners and allow greater press freedom. He also started the transition into a market economy. The changes that Gorbachev initiated began to snowball, and Soviet satellites in Eastern Europe gained a taste of freedom. Previously, attempts in liberation in Eastern Europe, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia had been met with Soviet tanks and Soviet anytime there was any type of rise up against power, the Soviets went in with the military action. But when the borders started to crumble in the late 1980s, Gorbachev was not willing to use forces against his own people. Some say the grip of the Soviet Communist power was weaker. But it was weaker because Gorbachev was a different type of leader who did not move the country in the direction was a different type of leader who did move the country in the direction of freedom. Comes to foreign policy, Gorbachev frankly surprised the West at the intensity and urgency with which he urged nuclear disarmament and to the ends of an arms race. At the start of the 80s, Ronald Reagan referred to the Soviet Union as the evil empire. But after a few years, even the staunch anti-communists saw Gorbachev was different. UK Premier Miss Thatcher famously remarked, "This is a man with whom we can do business with." So, thanks to him being a different type of leader and seeing that it was time for a change, he gets the UK and the United States to sit down and have conversations with him. End of communism, back to the bio. The freedom of the Eastern Europe and the end of the Cold War may all seem inevitable with the benefit of hindsight. But a different leader may have not been willing to relinquish power, allow press freedom, move the economy towards democracy. It was not just Gorbachev who ended the Cold War. Other figures played important roles. Pope John Paul III, Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, and many ordinary people of Eastern Europe who really smashed the Berlin Wall. But Gorbachev, more than anyone else, was the crucial piece in the jigsaw. It was only through Gorbachev that the grip of communists slipped and changed the world more than anyone in the 20th century. So, Gorbachev here was the right man at the right time. But as I said, it was all part of a jigsaw puzzle. Without having Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan on hand, all of these key players in that role, does the Berlin Wall come down? And if you really stop and think about it, once the wall came down, sections of it ended up being removed and sent to people. I believe there's a section at Ronald Reagan's museum in California. The Ford, Gerald Ford Presidential Library in Michigan has a section of it. And it's stuff like that which reminds us that freedom can be given and taken away pretty quick. And it really comes down to the person in charge at that time to have that influence, So the next one on the list, or the next one that comes up, was Winston Churchill. Number 5. Most people have a little bit of a idea who Winston Churchill was. There's been movies made about him, books written. Another person at the right time, Sir Winston Churchill, born November 30th, 1874. British politician, author, best known as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom during the Second World War. Churchill was famous for his stubborn resistance to Hitler during the darkest hours of the Second World War. Was born to a somewhat wealthy family. He was brought up by servants and friends of the family. He rarely spoke to his father, and he spent most of his childhood at a boarding school. Churchill wasn't the best student, having a rebellious nature, and was reportedly slow to learn. But Churchill excelled at sports, and joined the Officers Cadet Corps, which he enjoyed. So another guy here, as we go through this list, I think 2/3 of these people were not the best students. On leaving school, back to the bio. On leaving school, he went to Sandhurst to train as an officer. After gaining his commission, Churchill sought to gain as much active military experience as possible. He used his mother's connections to getting postings to areas of conflict. He also combined his military duties with working as a war correspondent, earning substantial money for his reports on the fighting. That's one thing that you cannot argue about. Churchill was good with the word. Back to the bio. In 1899, he resigned from the military and pursued his career as a war correspondent. He was in South Africa, and he became a minor celebrity for his role in taking part in a scouting patrol, getting captured and later escaping. He might have gained the Victoria Cross for his efforts, though officially he was a civilian at the time. After this experience, he'd gained temporary commission in the South Africa Light Horses and later commented that he had a good war while continuing his work as a war correspondent. So here's a guy that's going out of his way to be in the action. He wants to get experience. He's not going to sit back. And then he becomes a war correspondent, gets captured, and escapes. So back to the bio. Churchill returned to the UK in 1900 and successfully stood as a Conservative candidate. After becoming an MP, Churchill began a lucrative speaking tour where he could command a high price for his speeches. So again, comes back, gets this post, and goes around speaking. In 1904, he made a dramatic shift, leaving the Conservative Party and joining the Liberal Party. He was later often called a class traitor by some Conservative colleagues. Churchill disagreed with an increasing amount of the Conservative policies, including tariffs. Churchill also had some empathy for improving the welfare of the working class and helping the poor. In the Liberal Party, Churchill made a political rise. By 1908, he was made president of the Board of Trade, and he was a key supporter of Lloyd George's Radical People's Budget, a budget which saw the growth of a welfare state and introduction of the income to pay for it. The budget made a significant improvement to the life of the poor and helped address the inequality of British society. So here he is. He's worried about making all of the people's lives better, especially the working class. So back to the bio. On the outbreak of hostilities in Europe, Churchill was one of the most strident members of the cabinet, arguing for British involvement in the war. In August 1914, the Liberal cabinet was split, with some of the members against going to war on the continent. However, Churchill's view prevailed, and he admitted for being enthused about the prospects of being involved in the Great War. He went to Belgium, where he urged the Royal Marines to commit to the action. This decision was criticized for wasting resources. Others said it helped save the Channel ports from the advancing German army. Churchill also used naval funds to help develop the tank, something he felt would be useful in war. So here's a guy not just focused on being a politician, but he wants to build stuff to make the war effort easier for the UK. However, despite tremendous eagerness for war, his flagship policy for the war was deemed a failure. Churchill planned the 1915 campaign, a daring bid to knock Turkey out of the war, but unfortunately it proved a military failure with thousands of Allied casualties and no military gain. Although the fault of the failure was shared amongst others, Churchill resigned from his post and sought to gain a position in the Army of the Western Front. So here's a guy taking ownership of the failure, saying, nope, buck stops here. I'm going to resign my post, and I'm going to go get another position in the Army. Back to the bio. In 1917, Churchill was made Minister of Munitions, a job requiring strong administration skills. To manage limited resources during the war, Churchill was considered an efficient and skilled minister. At the end of the First World War, Churchill was active in trying to support the Russian White Army, who were trying to resist the Communist forces, which had gained control over the Soviet Union. Under advice from many economists, Churchill made the decision to return Britain to the gold standard at the pre-war level, but this proved to be damaging to the economy and led to a period of deflation, high unemployment, low growth. Churchill later admitted that this was his greatest domestic mistake. So, and we fast forward to 1930, his political eccentricities. So, 1930, he's put on the backbench, where he was a vocal critic of the appeasement and urged the government to rearm. Churchill was often a lone voice in speaking about the growing danger of Hitler's Germany. So, 1930, he's watching what's going on in the world and realizes that Hitler is gaining more and more power. Back to the bio. Churchill proved to be a great war leader. His speeches became famous and proved an important rally cry for the country, which stood alone through the difficult years of 1940 and 41. Those early years saw the Battle of Britain and the Blitz, a period where invasions by Germany seemed likely. So after an unsuccessful start to the Second World War, the Commons chose Churchill to lead the UK in a national coalition. Churchill was instrumental in insisting Britain keep fighting. He opposed the minority voices in the cabinet seeking to make any deal with Hitler. And here's a quote from one of his speeches in the House of Commons. "We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender." It was speeches like that help get Britain behind him. So, back to the bio. From 1943 onwards, Churchill spent more time managing the uneasy Allied coalition of the Soviet Union, the US, and the UK. Churchill was involved in many aspects of the war, taking interest in all areas, especially the build-up to the D-Day landings in Normandy. Churchill also participated in conferences with Stalin and Roosevelt, which helped shape the war and post-war settlement. With American money, Churchill played a role in avoiding the mistakes of the First World War, as the Allies sought to avoid harsh settlement and rebuild occupied Europe. So, took his lessons from the First World War and adapted those and applied those to post-World War II. Churchill was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1953 for his mastery of history and biography description, as well as for his brilliant ability to speak to the public in defending human values. Towards the end of his life, Churchill became a accomplished artist, though he found the years of retirement difficulty and suffered periods of depression. Churchill died at his house at the age of 90 on the morning of Sunday, the 24th of January, 1965. His funeral was the largest state funeral in the world up to that point. So here's a gentleman that lived to be 90 years old. Saw 2 world wars, led a country through a second world war, and just was so focused on what needed to be done, to draw upon his experiences of his youth, and just had this clarity of what he needed to do and what the country needed to do. The speeches that he gave kept the Britain people engaged with the hope. Again, right guy in the jigsaw, that right piece in that jigsaw at the right time, and then having FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, and the U.S. as the leader, Stalin, and Russia to come together, were more pieces in that puzzle. And then, so then this next person on this list is number 8. It's Martin Luther King. And King was somebody that, going through school, somebody that I read about, and so, Martin Luther King was one of America's most influential civil rights activists. His passionate but nonviolent protest helped to raise awareness of the racial inequalities in America, leading to significant political change. Martin Luther King was an elegant speaker who captured the imagination and the hearts of people. So, Martin Luther King was born in Atlanta on the 15th of January, 1929. Both his father and grandfather were pastors in an African-American Baptist church. So, with that type of background, you knew that he was around people who had great command of the language and had a great ability to speak. Back to the bio. During his time at the university, Martin Luther King became aware of the vast inequality and injustice faced by black Americans. In particular, he was influenced by Gandhi's philosophy of nonviolent protest. So, this is the base. This is where he becomes the guy that's gonna fight this injustice, but do it in a peaceful way. So, back to the bio. The Montgomery bus boycott. A turning point in the life of Martin Luther King was the Montgomery bus boycott, which he helped to promote. His boycott also became the turning point of the civil rights struggle, attracting national press for the cause. It began on December 5th, 1955 with Rosa Parks, a civil rights activist, refused to give up her seat. She was sitting in a white-only area. The bus broke. Oh, I'm sorry. This broke the strict segregation of colored and white people on the Montgomery buses. The bus company refused to back down, and so Martin Luther King helped to organize a strike where colored people refused to use any of the city buses. The boycott lasted for several months. The issue was then brought to the Supreme Court, who declared segregation was unconstitutional. And I'm not really sure who did these bios, and as we go through and cover some of the other ones, I think it'll become kind of clear, because I don't think there's a whole lot of information for Martin Luther King put in this one, and a little bit of inaccuracies on the Montgomery bus boycott, saying that it lasted several months. It lasted over a year. So back to the bio. After the success of the Montgomery bus boycott, King and other ministers founded the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or SCLC. This provided to be the nucleus for the growing civil rights movement. Later, there would be arguments about the best approach to take. In particular, the 1960s saw the rise of the Black Power movement by Malcolm X and other black nationalist groups. However, King always remained committed to the ideals of nonviolent struggle. So some of the speeches King gave are still spoke of today. So Martin Luther King was an inspirational and influential speaker. He had the capacity to move and uplift his audience. In particular, he could offer a vision of hope. He captured the injustice of the time, but also felt that this injustice was like a passing cloud. King frequently made references to God, the Bible, and his Christian faith. So some of the here's an excerpt from one of his speeches. How is it that you see the splitter in your brother's eye and fail to see the plank in your own eye? And this is one of the tragedies of human nature. So we begin to love our enemies and love those persons that hate us, whether in collective life or individual life, by looking at ourselves. So King saying, how are you so blind to see the splinter in your... No, it says, how are you so blind to see the big plank of wood in your eye, but you focused on the splinter, this little detail in your brother's eye? Back to the bio. His speeches were largely free of revenge instead of focusing on the need to move forward. He was named Man of the Year by Time magazine in 1963. It followed his famous and iconic I Have a Dream speech delivered in Washington during a civil rights march. And an excerpt from that. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at a table of brotherhood. Probably one of his more famous speeches, and one that has probably been just that first I Have a Dream part's been replayed over. It gets probably played every year on Martin Luther King Day. But to sit there and say that one day I hope to see those people who were slave owners and were slaves sit together at the time was pretty revolutionary. Back to the bio. The following year, Martin Luther King was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his work towards social justice. King announced he would turn over the prize money of $54,123 to the civil rights movement. With the prestige of the Nobel Prize, King was increasingly consulted by politicians, even the President Lyndon Johnson. However, King's opposition to the Vietnam War did not endear him to the Johnson administration. King also began receiving increased scrutiny from the authorities, such as the FBI. And then on April 4th, 1968, King was assassinated in Memphis. It was one day after he had delivered his final speech, "I've been to the mountaintop." There's no doubt that King, again, was a key piece in that jigsaw puzzle of the 60s. Took a stance to get the rights to be the same for all parties, but did it in a way where, in a nonviolent way. Just to think back, the Civil Rights March on D.C., the speech, all those people at the gathered there. It's just something we really don't see anymore. I'm sure there are events that are slipping my mind right now, but Martin Luther King will always be somebody that has that mark in history. He stood up. He joined Rosa Parks in Alabama, and then from there just catapulted himself up to be one of the people, not only just in the U.S. to have the nation's ear, but globally. Just makes you wonder, if that fateful day in Memphis hadn't happened, where would have the nation gone? What would have King done? Just one of those things that you just got to stop and think about. So we're creeping up on almost an hour here. I had no idea that just doing 3 of these would be an hour. So this may be more than 2 episodes, because there's a lot of these people that I really just want to talk about to get the conversation started, and then moving forward. I think some of these people need more than what is just a couple pages covered. It's kind of the basis of I guess the foundation of what I'm built on is some of these leaders, their influence, indirectly, directly. You just, as they say, if we don't keep an eye on history, we're doomed to repeat it. But at the same time, if we stay too long looking in the past, we don't see where we're going. So we kind of say that those two sayings are similar but different. I'm just going to go ahead and wrap this one up here. And we'll start the other ones shortly. I hope you guys see value in this. It's not the most probably in-depth or elegant thing out there on these people, but I think it's a start. And I would love to have conversations about some of these people. If anybody's got any books that cover, these 3 subjects so far that you'd recommend, I definitely would be open to that. Um, so, with that being said, I'm going to wrap this one up. Just make sure as uh, as you go out there and do the things in your life that you always stay warm and fuzzy inside, and make sure your Care Bear is being well taken care of. So with that, take care. Talk to you soon.